something to do, said I, one Tribulation Periwinkle by name. I want something to do. This remark being addressed to the world in general, no one in particular felt it their duty to reply, so I repeated it to the smaller world about me and received the following suggestions. Write a book, quoth my father. Don't know enough yet, sir. Live first, then write. Try teaching again, said my mother. No, thank you, ma'am. 10 years of that is enough. Take a husband and fulfill your mission, says Sister Joan, home on a visit. No, thank you. Turn actress and immortalize your name, said Sister Vashti, striking an attitude. I won't. Go nurse the soldiers, said my young brother Tom. And I replied, I will. So far, very good. Here was the will, now for the way. I felt that I could do the work, was offered a position, and accepted it, promising not to desert, but stand ready to march on Washington at an hour's notice. A few days were necessary for the letter containing my request and recommendation to reach headquarters, and another containing my commission to return. Therefore, no time was to be lost, and I heartily tore through the December slush as if the rebels were after me, and like many another recruit, burst in on my family with the announcement, I've enlisted! An impressive silence followed. My brother Tom broke it with the slap on the shoulder and the graceful compliment, Old Trib, you're a trump, as boys going out to sea immediately become nautical in nature, walk as if they've had their sea legs on, and shiver their timbers on all possible occasions. So I turned military at once, called my dinner my rations, saluted all newcomers, and ordered a dress parade that very afternoon. I had time to grow powerfully impatient before the letter arrived. It did come, however, and brought a disappointment along with its goodwill and friendliness, for it told me that the position I supposed I was to take at the Armory Hospital had already been filled, and a much less desirable one at Hurly-Burly House had been offered instead. I have a confused recollection of pervading the house that afternoon like an executive whirlwind, with my family all swarming behind me, working, talking, prophesying, and lamenting, as I packed my go-abroadly possessions, tumbled the rest into 2 great boxes, danced on the lids till they shut, and gave the directions, if I never come back, make a bonfire of them. Then I choked down a cup of tea generously salted instead of sugared by some agitated relative, shouldered my knapsack. It was only a traveling bag, but do let me preserve the unities. Hugged my family 3 times all round without a vestige of unmanly emotion, until my mother broke down upon my neck with a despairing sort of wail. Oh, my dear, how can I let you go? I'll stay if you say so, Mother. But I don't. Go, and the Lord will take care of you. In spite of my mother's tears, she would have sent 10 sons to the war, had she possessed them, as freely as she sent 1 daughter, smiling and flapping on the doorsteps until I vanished, though the eyes that followed me were very dim, and the handkerchief she waved was very wet. My transit from the Gables to the village depot was a funny mixture of goodbyes and good wishes, of mud puddles and shopping. A December twilight is not the most cheering time to enter upon a somewhat perilous enterprise. And but for the presence of Vashti and neighbor Thorne, I fear I may have added a drop of briny to the native moisture of the town I left behind me. I'm a woman's rights woman, and if any man had offered help that day, I should have condescendingly refused it, certain that I could do everything as well, if not better, myself. As travelers like to give their own impressions of a journey, though every inch of the way may have been described half a dozen times before, I add some of the notes made by the way, hoping that they'll amuse you and convince the skeptical that such a being as Nurse Periwinkle does exist, that she really did go to Washington, and that this story is not a romance. 7 p.m. New York train, spinning along to take the boat at New London. Very comfortable. Munch gingerbread and Mrs. C's fine pear, which deserves honorable mention, for my first loneliness was comforted by it. Look much at Dr. H's paper of directions, put my tickets in every conceivable place that they may be get-outable, and finish by losing them entirely. Suffer agonies until a compassionate neighbor pokes them out of a crack with his penknife, put them in the inmost corner of my purse, then in the deepest recesses of my pocket. Just get composed, feeling as though I've done my best to keep them safely, when the conductor appears and I'm forced to root them all out again, exposing my precautions and getting into a flutter at keeping the man waiting. Finally, fasten them on the seat before me and keep one eye steadily on the yellow torments until I forget all about them and chat with the gentleman who shares my seat. I put my bashfulness in my pocket as we plunge into a long discussion on the war, weather, music, skating, genius, hoops, and the immortality of the soul. 10 p.m. Very sleepy. Nothing to be seen outside but darkness made visible. Nothing inside but every variety of bunch into which the human form can be twisted. Every man's legs sprawl drowsily. Every woman's head, but mine, nods until it finally settles on somebody's shoulders. Children fret, lovers whisper, old folks snore, and somebody privately imbibes brandy when the lights go out. 11 p.m. Aboard the boat, City of Boston, escorted thither by my car acquaintance and deposited into the cabin, trying to look as though the greater portion of my life has been spent on board boats, but painfully conscious that I don't know the first thing. So sit bolt upright and stare about me until I hear one lady say to another, "We must secure our berths at once," whereupon I dart at one, all while leisurely taking off my cloak, and wait to discover what the second move may be. The boat is new, but if it ever intends to blow up, spring a leak, catch fire, or be run into, it will do the deed tonight, because I'm here to fulfill my destiny. At last, while listening to the swash of the waves outside, wondering if the machinery usually creaked in that way, and watching a knothole in my berth, certain that death would creep in as soon as I took my eye from it, I fell asleep and dreamed of muffins. 7 a.m. Philadelphia, an old place full of Dutch women in Fellis top bonnets selling vegetables in long overcoats. Everyone seems to be squatted their white steps. The houses look like tiny jail for several have crape on the door handles. Many have flags flying and torn out. Few men are here. The women seem to do the work, which perhaps accounts for it being so well done. Past fine houses, but don't know what they are. Would like to stop and see my native city, for having left it at the tender age of 2, my recollections are not vivid. Baltimore, a big, dirty, shiftless place full of goats, geese, and coal, at least the parts of it that I see. Passed near the spot where the riot took place, and felt as though I should enjoy throwing a stone at somebody. Hard. Washington. It was dark when we arrived, and but for the presence of another friendly gentleman, I should have yielded myself a helpless prey to the first overpowering hackman who insisted I wanted to go just where I didn't. Putting me into the conveyance where I belonged, my escort added to the obligation by pointing out the objects of interest which we passed on our long drive. Though I'd often been told that Washington was a spacious place, its visible magnitude quite took my breath away. And of course I quoted Randolph's famous expression, "A city of magnificence." need your help. I am free to confess to a realizing sense of the fact that my hospital bed was not a bed of roses just then, nor the prospect before me one of unmingled rapture. My 3 days' experiences had begun with a death, and owing to the defalcation of another nurse, a somewhat sudden plunge into the superintendence of a ward containing 40 beds, where I spent my shining hours in washing faces, serving rations, giving medicine, and sitting in a very hard chair with pneumonia on one side, diphtheria on the other, 5 typhoids all round, and a dozen dilapidated patriots, all hopping, lying, and lounging about, and all staring more or less at the new nurse who suffered untold agonies but concealed them under as matronly an aspect as a spinster could assume, blundering through her trying labors with a Spartan firmness which I hope they appreciated, but am afraid they did not. Having a taste for gas. Neither was liver complaint or measles. Even fever had lost its charm since bathing burning brows had been used up in romance's real and ideal. But when I peered into the dusty streets, lined with what I at first had innocently called market carts, now unloading their sad freight at our a regiment of the vilest odors that ever assaulted the human nose and took it by storm. Cologne, with its 77 evil savors, was a cozy bed to it, and the worst of this affliction was everyone assured me it was a chronic weakness of all hospitals, and I must bear it. I did, armed with lavender water, with which I so sprinkled myself and premises that I was soon known among my patients as the nurse with the bottle. I progressed by slow stages up and then down until the main hall was reached, and I paused to take breath and a survey. There they were, our brave boys, as the papers justly called them, for cowards could hardly have been so riddled with shot and shell, so torn and shattered, nor have borne suffering for which we have no name, with an uncomplaining fortitude, which made one glad to cherish each as a brother. In they came, some on stretchers, some in men's arms, some feebly staggered along, propped on rude crutches, and one lay stark and still with covered face, as his comrade gave his name to be recorded before they carried him to the dead house. All was hurry and confusion. The halls were filled with these wrecks of humanity, for the most exhausted could not reach a bed until duly ticketed and registered. The walls were lined with such as could sit, the floor covered with the more disabled, the stairs and doorways filled with helpers and lookers-on. The sound of many feet and voices made that usually quiet hour as noisy as noon. And in the midst of it all, the matron's motherly face brought more comfort to many a poor soul than the cordial draught she administered, or the cheering words that welcomed all, making of the hospital a home. The sight of several stretchers, each with its armless, legless, or desperately wounded occupant entering my ward, admonished me that I was there to work, not to wonder or weep. So I corked up my feelings and returned to the path of duty, which was rather a hard road to travel just then. The house had been a hotel before hospitals were needed, and many of the doors still bore their old names, some not so as inappropriate as might be imagined, for my ward was in truth a ballroom, if gunshot wounds could christen it. 40 beds were prepared, many tenanted by tired men who fell down anywhere, and drowsed until the smell of food roused them. Round the great stove was gathered the dreariest group I ever saw, ragged, gaunt, and pale, with mud to the knees and bloody bandages untouched since put on days before, many bundled up in blankets, coats being lost or useless, and all wearing that disheartened look which proclaimed defeat. I pitied them so much I dared not speak to them, but remembering all that they had been through since the rout at Fredericksburg, I longed to serve the dreariest of them all. Presently, Miss Blank tore me from my refuge behind piles of one-sleeve shirts, socks, bandages, and lint, put basin, towel, sponge, and a block of brown soap in my hands with these appalling directions. Come, my dear, begin to wash at once. Tell them to take off socks, coats, and shirts, put clean shirts on, scrub them well, and the attendants will take care of them and lay them in bed. If she had requested me to shave them all, I should have been less staggered. But to scrub some dozen lords of creation at a moment's notice was really. However, there was no time for nonsense, and having resolved when I came to do everything I was bid, drown my scruples in my basin, clutch my soap, took to the performance like sleepy children, leaning their heads against me as I worked. blown off the shoulder, still a good bullet, still generally my caution. My Indian but when I approached it, shall I try to make you more comfortable, sir? All I got from my team was no, do it myself. Chivalry with a witness behind, dumping the basin down for him, thereby clenching a strong desire to give him a summary baptism in return for his ungratefulness. But my angry passion rose as it took up in a way that would have scandalized a good doctor. All the that is resembled a dripping merman suffering from the loss of a fin. If cleanliness is a near neighbor of godliness, so is this big rebel the godliest man in my ward that day. Having done up our human wash and left it out to dry, great trays of bread, meat, soup, and coffee appeared. Nurses and attendants both turned waiters, serving bountiful rations to all who could eat. I could call upon my pinafore to testify to my goodwill in the work, for in 10 minutes it was reduced to a perambulating bill of fare, presenting samples of all of the refreshments. Very grateful seemed the generous meal. After a week of suffering, exposure, shortcomings, soon the faces lighted up as food, warmth, and rest did their merry work. And the grateful thank yous were followed by more graphic accounts of battles. Met one everywhere. A 6-foot human with his legs broken and perforated by shells so large that, had I not seen the ghost that was dark stories of what's not there, beckoned me from the house. For he could not sit up, and both bed and ears were plentifully of blood. As I fed my big neck, well, 'twas my first, you see, so I ain't ashamed to say I was a trifle flustered in the beginning. There was such an all-fired racket. But when my mate, Eb Sylvester, caved with a bullet through the head, I got mad and pitched in lickety-cut. Our part of the fight didn't last long, so a lot of us larked round Fredericksburg and gave some of them houses a pretty considerable rummage till we was ordered out of the mess. A lot of the fellas cut like time, but I warn't going rum for nobody. First thing I knew, a shell bust down in front of us, and I keeled over, feeling as though I were blown higher than a kite. I sung out, and the boys came back for me double quick. But the way they tossed me over them fences was a caution, I tell you. This is bully coffee, ain't it? Give us another pull at it and I'll be obliged to you. I did, and as the last gulp subsided, he said with a dab of his handkerchief over eyes as well as mouth, "Looky here. I got a pair of earbobs and a hankerpin I'm going to give you, if you'll have them. For you're the very picture of Lizzie Sylvester, poor Ep's wife. That's why I signaled you to come over here. They ain't much, I guess, but they'll do." Burrowing under his pillow, he gallantly presented me with a pair of earrings, each representing a cluster of corpulent grapes, and the pin a basket of astonishing fruit. Feeling delicate at depriving him of such valuable relics, I accepted the earrings alone, and was obliged to depart somewhat abruptly when my friend stuck the warming pan in the bosom of his nightgown, viewing it with much complacency, and perhaps some tender memory in that rough heart of his for the comrade that he had lost. Observing that the man next to him had left his meal untouched, I offered the same service that I provided for his neighbor, but he shook his head. "No, miss. I don't think I'll ever eat again, for I'm shot in the stomach. But I'd like a drink of water if you ain't too busy." I hurried away, but the water pails were gone to be refilled, and it was some time before they reappeared. I did not forget my patient meanwhile, and with the first mugful hurried back to him. He seemed asleep, but something in that pale, tired face of his caused me to listen at his lips for a breath. None came. I touched his forehead. It was cold. And then I knew that while he had waited, a better nurse than I had given him a cooler draught and healed him with a touch. I laid a sheet over the quiet sleeper, whom no noise could now disturb, and in a half an hour his bed was empty. It seemed a poor requital for all that he had suffered and sacrificed. That hospital bed, lonely even in a crowd, where there was no familiar face for him to look his last upon, no friendly voice to say goodbye, no hand to lead him gently into the valley of the shadow. And he vanished, like a drop in that great red sea upon whose shores so many women stand lamenting. For a moment I felt bitterly indignant at the seeming carelessness for the value of life, the sanctity of death. But then I consoled myself with the thought that when the great muster roll was called, these nameless men might be promoted above many, whose tall monuments record the barren honors that they have won. All having eaten, drank, and rested, the surgeons began their rounds, and I took my first lesson in the art of dressing wounds. It was not a festive scene by any means, for Dr. P., whose aide I constituted myself, fell to work with vigor. He had served in the Crimea and seemed to regard a dilapidated body very much as I should have regarded a damaged garment, and rolling up he procured a cutting, sawing, piecing, and patching with the enthusiasm of an accomplished surgical seamstress, explaining the process meanwhile in scientific terms. Uncanny sort of fascination in watching him as he peered and probed into the mechanisms of these wonderful bodies, whose mysteries he seemed to understand so well. The more intricate the wound, the better he liked it. A poor private, with both legs blown off and a shot through the lung, possessed more attractions for him than a dozen generals. And if anyone had appeared to him in pieces requesting to be put back together again, he should have considered it a special dispensation. The amputations were reserved until the morrow, and the merciful drops appeared on their foreheads, and their beds shook with the irrepressible tremor of their tortured bodies. It was well past noon before these repairs were even partially made, and having gotten the bodies of my boys into something like order, the next task was to minister to their minds in writing letters to the anxious souls at home, answering questions, reading newspapers, and taking possession of money and valuables. Pocketbooks, purses, watches, and miniatures were sealed up, labeled, and handed off to the matron until such time as the owners thereof were ready to depart homeward or campward again. The letters dictated to me and revised by me would have made an excellent chapter in some future history of the war. They were full of affection, pluck, and bad spelling, nearly all giving lively accounts of the battle, and ending in a somewhat sudden plunge from patriotism to provender, desiring Mama, Marianne, or Aunt Peters to send along some pies, pickles, sweet stuff, and apples to you in haste, Joe, Sam, or Ned, as the case may be. Then came the doctor's evening visit, the administration of medicines, washing feverish faces, smoothing tumbled beds, wetting wounds, singing lullabies, and preparations for the night. By 12, the last labor of love was done, the last good night spoken. And if any needed a reward for that night's work, they surely received it in the silent eloquence of those long lines of faces, showing pale and peaceful in the shaded room as we quitted them, followed by grateful glances that lighted us to bed. For rest and sweetest made our pillows soft. All night nature took our places, filling that great house with the healing miracles of sleep, and his diviner brother, death. Being fond of the night side of nature, I was soon promoted to the midnight nurse. My colleague, a black-eyed widow, relieved me at dawn, I usually found my boys in the jolliest state of mind that their conditions allowed, for it was a well-known fact that nurse had laughed most shores under covers. My ward was now divided into 3 rooms, and under favor of the matron, I managed to sort out my patients in a way that I now had what I called my beauty room, my pleasure room, and my pathetic room. I worked for each in a different way. One I visited armed with a serving tray of rolling plasters and pins. The other with books, flowers, games, and gossip. And the third with teapots, eyes, consolation, and sometimes a shroud. I would have given much to have possessed the art of sketching, for many of the faces grew wonderfully interesting. Some of them grew stern and grim, the men evidently dreaming of war as they gave orders, groaned over their wounds, and damned the rebels vigorously. Others looked sad and infinitely pathetic, as though the king borne silently all day now betrayed himself by revealing what the man's pride considered so low. Often the roughest looked young and peaceful, and seemed to move the hard lines away. The true nature asserted itself. Many almost seemed to speak, and I soon learned to know these men better by night than in any intercourse by day. Sometimes they disappointed me, for faces that looked merry and good for life, dry, though they made no confidences in words, and said their lives, and left them to wonder at the sudden change this midnight magic had wrought in their nurse. Wandering up and down the lower halls, the echo of the sob caused me to glance over the beds. I came to one in the corner. Such a little bed, and such a tearful little face looked up at me as I went to it. 12-years-old drummer boy was not singing now. He was sobbing, a manly effort all the while to stifle the distressful sounds that would break out. "What is it, Teddy?" I asked, as he wiped the tears from his face. "I got a chill, ma'am, but I ain't crying 'cause of that, for I'm used to it. I dreamed Kit was here, and when I waked up he wasn't, and then I couldn't help it. The boy had come in with the rest, and the man they carried dead from the ambulance was the kid that he mourned. Well, he might, for when the wounded were brought from Fredericksburg, this boy lay in one of the camps thereabouts, and his kind friend, though sorely hurt himself, would not leave him to the exposure and suffering of such time and place, but wrapping him up in his own blanket, carried him in his arms to the transport, tended to him during the passage, and only lifted up his charge when death met him at the door of the hospital, which promised care and comfort for the boy. 10 days Teddy had shivered or burned with fever, pining all the while for Kit, and refusing to be comforted, because he could not thank his friend for the generous protection, which perhaps cost the giver's life. Oh, if only I'd been as thin when Kit carried me as I am now. Maybe he wouldn't have died. But I was heavy, he was hurt worser than we knew. And so I didn't get to see him to say goodbye. The thought had troubled him in secret, and my assurances that his friend probably would have died at all events partly assuaged the bitterness of his regret for grief. Hardly was I settled again when I received a message that I had expected, yet dreaded to receive. John is going, ma'am, and would like to see you if you can come. John had come in a day or two after. As though it were rich in duties and delights, and he had learned the secret of content. The only time that I ever saw his composure disturbed was when my surgeon brought in another to examine John, who scrutinized their faces with an anxious look, asking of the doctor, "Do you think I shall pull through, sir?" "We will see, my man." And as the two parted, his eyes followed them with an intentness that would have won a clearer answer from them had they seen it. A momentary shadow flitted over his face, and then came the usual serenity, as though in that brief eclipse he had acknowledged the existence of some hard possibility, and asking nothing yet hoping all things, left the issue in God's hands. The next night, as I made my rounds with Dr. P., I happened to ask who in the room probably suffered the most, and to my great surprise, he glanced at John. "Well, every breath he draws is like a stab, for the ball pierced the left lung, broke rib, and did no end of damage here and there. So the poor lad has to suffer as best he might, for he must either lie on his wound back or suffocate. It will be a hard battle, and a long one, for he possesses great vitality. Even his tempered life can't save him. I wish it could." "You don't mean he must die, doctor?" "Bless you. There's not the slightest hope for him. And you'd better tell him so before long. Women have a way of doing such things. So I leave it to you. He won't last more than a day or two at furthest." I could have sat down on the spot and cried heartily, had I not learned the wisdom of bottling up one's tears for leisure moments. Such an end seemed very hard for such a man, when half a dozen worn-out bodies round him were to linger on for years, perhaps. The army needed men like John, earnest, faithful, and true. I could not give him up so soon. It was all very easy for Dr. P. to say, "Tell him he must die," but a cruelly hard thing. John looked long as he sat with bent head, hands folded at the knees, after a sigh of suffering, until looking nearer, I saw great tears roll down and drop upon the floor. It was a new sight there, for though I had seen many suffer, Some groaned, some swore, most endured silently, but none wept. Yet it did not seem weak, only very touching. And straightway my fears vanished, my heart opened wide to let him in, as, gathering his bent head in my hands, as though he had been a little child, I said, "Let me help you to bear it, John." Never on any human countenance have I seen so swift and beautiful a look of gratitude, surprise, and comfort as that which answered me more eloquently than the whispered, "Thank you. This is right good. This is what I had wanted." Then why not ask for it before? I didn't want to be a bother. You seemed so busy, and I could manage to get on alone. You shall not want it any more, John. Nor did he, for now I understood the wistful look that sometimes followed me as I went, after a brief pause beside his bed, or merely a passing nod, busied with those who seemed to need me more than he. Now I understood that in his eyes, as to so many others, I was the poor substitute for mother, wife, or sister, and to him, no stranger, but a friend. Although the manliest man in my 40, he said, "Yes, ma'am," like a little boy, and took suggestions for his ease with a smile that lighted up his whole face. And now and again, as I stood tidying the table next to his bed, I felt him softly touch my gown, as though to assure himself that I was still there. After that evening, an hour or two of each day that remained to him was devoted to his ease or pleasure. He could not speak much, for breath was precious, and he only spoke in whispers. Yet through occasional conversations, I gleaned scraps of private history, which only added to the admiration and respect that I felt for him. Once he asked me to write a letter, and while settling pen to paper, I asked, "Shall it be addressed to your wife or mother-in-law?" "Ma'am, I've got no wife, and will write to mother when I am better." "Did you think I was married because of this?" he asked, touching a plain ring on his finger that he wore and occasionally turned thoughtfully when he was alone. "Partly from that, but more from a settled sort of look you have that young men seldom get until they marry." "I didn't know that. But I'm not so very young, ma'am. 30 in May, and I have been what you may call settled these last 10 years. For mother's a widow. I'm the oldest she has, and it wouldn't do for me to marry until Lizzie had a home of her own and Laurie's learned his trade. Or we're not rich." "John, how came you to go to war if you felt so? Was it enlisting as bad as marrying?" "No, ma'am, not as I see it. For one is helping my neighbor, and the other pleasing myself. I went because I couldn't help it. I didn't want the glory or the pay, but the right thing done. And people kept saying that men who were in earnest ought to go and fight. I was in earnest, the Lord knows. But I held off for a long time, not knowing which was my duty. Mother saw the case